Hello and welcome to ChooseFI. Today on the show, we have a real treat. We have a listener case study, and this was a really cool one. So last year in episode 463, we had an episode called From Food Stamps to FI. And I introduced you to one of our community members named Teresa, and it was a remarkable story. So if you're new to ChooseFI, you haven't heard this episode, just stop listening to this right now. Go back to episode 463. I think it is just the perfect embodiment of what a community is all about. You're really going to get a lot of value out of that. So anyway, towards the end of that episode, Teresa was talking about the struggles she was having figuring out her next steps. And I basically said, hey, why don't we reach out to a retirement expert in our community to help you sort out this transition from, okay, we are financially independent, but now we want to reach retire early status. And what do we have to do to get from here to there? So that episode came out on September 3rd, 2023. 4 days later, I reached out to my good buddy Fritz from the retirementmanifesto.com and asked him if he could help out with this. I just thought he'd be the perfect person. And he instantly said yes, which was really wonderful. And they spent hours upon hours going over Teresa's situation and coming up with a case study that we're going to bring to you today. I think you're going to get a lot of value out of this, no matter where you are in your FI journey. So with that, welcome to ChooseFI. All right. This should be fun. Fritz and Teresa, thank you both for being here. And thank you for the time and care you both put into this.
Hey, thanks for having me back on. And Teresa, great to see you again. And I loved your first episode. And I was really honored to be able to be a part of the crowdsourcing solution to your situation. We had a lot of fun working on this together.
We did. Thank you so much for saying yes. And I'm so happy to be back on the show.
Yeah, this should be really great. And Fritz, you used the perfect word, which is crowdsourcing. That is how we have conceptualized ChooseFI from the very, very beginning. And thank you so much for stepping up and helping and just giving, like I said, your time, care, attention, your expertise. It's wonderful. So really appreciate that. And you also had some other people step up.
Yeah, I took your crowdsourcing another step further. I reached out to Steve Chen at New Retirement and Mike Piper at Oblivious Investor as part of this, and they both jumped in and helped out as well. So this thing has really gotten some legs, and there's quite a few people in the community that have been involved.
Yeah, it's remarkable. It is absolutely remarkable. So, all right, let's dive into it. So, Fritz, now you obviously have spent a lot of hours with Teresa. You've thought about this in terms of a process, right? Because I think that was some of the trepidation was how do I get from here to there, right? And the reason why we're doing this on the podcast is there are a whole lot of people listening who need to figure out how do I get from here to there. I believe I'm FI, or I think I'm FI on paper, but A, how do I discern that for real? And B, how do I actually make this leap to RE at some point in the future? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
So yeah, Brad, really the question that Teresa had is the same that everybody has. It's when can I retire? When can I stop working? And I think the process that we used is really the value for the listeners. Obviously, Teresa's is a great story and it was a pleasure to work with her, but I think the benefit for everybody is how did we answer the question? And on our first call, Teresa and I talked about kind of the methodology. And we agreed that taking a parallel approach where we do it in a spreadsheet, but then we also bring in a retirement calculator. I really like what New Retirement's doing. So she was already a user. It made sense. So we ran parallel models. One was with a calculator, New Retirement, and one was with a spreadsheet. The fortunate thing is New Retirement also threw in a couple of really nice bonuses for Teresa. And we got some time with the CFP. We got some time with one of their model experts. Thanks to Steve and his team. That was really generous of them to offer those up. So we definitely need to give a shout out. Maybe we can circle back and touch on those because there was some value in that as well.
Yeah, they are great friends of the show. I've known Steven for a while. And yeah, we do have a link at ChooseFI.com/new retirement. And that's in the show notes just for anybody who wants just a nice, easy way to click over there. It's just a really great product.
And it's a great model. I think Teresa was already using it. She's comfortable with it. So let's walk through kind of how we did each of those. And we started with a spreadsheet because even if you're going to use a calculator, you have to have certain assumptions. What's your net worth, right? What's your spending going to be? So Teresa and I felt more comfortable. She's very good with spreadsheets. So we just set up a Google worksheet where we could share it and we were working back and forth. You've seen it. We sent it to you so you could look through it. And we just started building tabs based on the questions we were trying to answer. So the first thing we did was we started with her net worth and we updated her current net worth. And then the question is, how is that going to change each year? So Teresa built a tab where she calculated her savings every year. Here's how much I'm going to save in my 401k. Here's how much I'm going to save in my after-tax brokerage account. And we just adjusted those lines in the net worth by how much she was going to contribute every year. And we put in an estimated growth rate every year. And we could project her net worth year on year on year as far as we wanted to go. So we looked at that as the first line. It's income and spending, right? That's the formula you're trying to solve. So as we projected her net worth out, we would put a calculation down below where using a 4% safe withdrawal rate, here's how much income you could draw. At a 3.5% safe withdrawal rate, here's how much income you could draw. And as that net worth increased, you could see her ability to spend increased. So we now know how much income she can count on. Well, how's that going to compare to spending, right? So we created another tab that Teresa did all on her own, where she calculated their current spending and how she expected that would change in retirement. And then it's just a matter of when do the lines cross, right? It's not rocket science, it's math. And we came up with an answer of 2029-ish. There's always some play in the numbers. How conservative do you want to be on your spending? How aggressive do you want to be on your growth? It's an unknowable answer. But we knew when the lines crossed, and we knew when the income from her portfolio would cover their spending. Good enough. Now let's look at new retirement and see how that compares. So Teresa, I'll throw it over to you. Any comments on the spreadsheet work that we did?
So I think you covered it all pretty well, Fritz. I did want to talk about my question on Social Security because I don't have my 35 years of earnings in. I was wondering how that would impact my drawdowns or my Social Security benefits when I do start withdrawing. So we used a tool from Open Social Security, which is a Mike Piper tool. And I was able to play around with those numbers and figure out, if I were to retire at 31 years of earnings, what is my estimated Social Security coming in? If I were to withdraw 5 years from now, what would my earnings be? So it was important, I think, for me to understand those numbers. And if I did have some zeros, it's not the end of the world. I did see a pattern of probably the longer I worked, I would earn about an extra $100 a month. And so each year it would go up by $100. So for every year I continued to work, I would earn an additional $1,200 from Social Security.
So, okay, let's slow down here because I think this is important. And it's funny because as we're recording this, our good friend of the show, Cody Garrett, just mentioned this in the Facebook group and tagged me and said, oh, this would be something interesting to talk about on a future ChooseFI episode. And lo and behold, within 24 hours, we're actually talking about it. So this is amazing.
Crowdsourcing.
Right? Yeah, it is all about crowdsourcing. So, okay, as I understand it, and Fritz, I'd love for you to jump in after I'm done here, is Social Security works on your highest 35 years of income history. Now, naturally, for people who are retiring early, however you want to define that, 35 years is a very heavy lift. It's going to be hard to get to that 35 years. Assuming, let's say you go to college, you come out at 22, you're at 57, right? Before you have all 35 years. So for a lot of people, there are going to be zeros in there as part of some of these years. And I think a lot of us are concerned, how is that going to impact us? Is this going to crater my potential Social Security? And Teresa, what you just said, and now naturally this is person specific, I have to assume based on the number of years you put in. So I believe based on our last conversation, we're about the same age, so early to mid 40s. And so I know I have about 22 years at this point. I assume yours is somewhere plus or minus the same. And I guess that means every subsequent year you would work. You're saying you get $100 more in Social Security benefits. So it's about $1,200 per year. But that's actually, to be perfectly honest, not as massive as I feared, which is really great.
I agree. So I'm at my 30-year mark.
Oh.
So I only have 5 more to hit the goal.
Amazing.
And although $1,200 a year isn't very much, I think over that additional 5-year period, it would be a significant increase.
Yeah. And we should say too, Mike Piper was the one that gave the tool. I just sent you the link. You can put it in the show notes, ssa.tools. But, if you think about it this way, if it's calculated based on 35 years of earnings and you miss 3 years, okay, that's about 10%, right? I don't know if it's linear. I didn't know the answer when I listened to your show, Brad, and that was one of her questions, like, I don't know the answer to that one. But that's the beauty of crowdsourcing. Mike's like, oh yeah, here's a place where you can blow in zeros and it'll calculate it for you. And Teresa did and said, oh, that was easy. Now I know the impact. And it was done. So that link was very helpful.
That is awesome. So ssa.tools. And
Yep.
that's, a big hat tip to Mike Piper on that. Thank you for stepping in.
Yeah, you can also go down the rabbit hole on this one, just like with anything else, because, looking at my Social Security statements, my first, 10 years of earnings was so low. And I'm sure that if I were to continue working, those higher earnings would bump out the lower earnings. But again, where do you draw the line? When is enough enough? And when do you step away and say, I have what I need. I don't need to optimize everything. I don't need to max everything out. And some other things that my husband Paul and I have been talking about, because he's about 11 years older than I am, when should he start drawing down his Social Security and when should I start? So there was another tool that we worked with, Fritz, if you can.
Yep, it's Open Social Security Calculator. Again, that was developed by Mike Piper. And you put in each of the spouse's Social Security numbers from the Social Security website, and it will tell you the dates that you should claim spousal, that he should claim, wait for full benefit. It literally will say April of 2025 is when he should claim. I mean, it's very specific.
Yeah.
And that was very useful. So that's opensocialsecurity.com. We'll have a link to that as well.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And you get those actual details off of the My account at the ssa.gov, right?
Correct.
So you can just
Exactly.
Google My SSA, and it took me right to this. I had created an account years ago. Frankly, I don't remember when or why I did that. But for instance, I still have to create an account for my wife, Laura. So I'm going to be going through this now. And with the actual numbers you're getting from ssa.gov, you can then plug them into one or both of these and figure out, okay, here's how I actually make decisions off of this. I mean, guys, this is gold. This is wonderful.
Yeah, and I should mention too, Brad and Teresa, not to self-promote, but I have written a couple articles on this, and I actually wrote one called How to Determine When to Claim Social Security. And it took me about 15 minutes using this tool to come up with the dates that my wife is going to start claiming hers, the dates I'm going to start claiming mine. And it's driven by a bunch of algorithms that supposedly maximize your lifelong benefits. But I'll send a copy of that link. It's got links to the calculator and it shows how I used it. It covers exactly what we're talking about.
That is brilliant. That's going to be so helpful because, Social Security seems to be a black box for a lot of people in the FI community for a number of reasons. I think so many of us are just ultra conservative when it comes to our money, and we factor our FI number and don't think of Social Security at all, which means by definition, we're being too conservative with our safe withdrawal rate, right?
Yeah.
And I think the other thing is there is some political concern about whether Social Security will be there and in what form. I think based on, and this is not the platform to dive into this, and we could not prognosticate anyway, based on everything I've heard, I think the worst case scenario is 70% of current benefits is what most people are saying is realistically the worst you can anticipate. So if you want to factor that in and even be more conservative, take whatever it's showing you and multiply it by either 0.7 or 0.6, call it a day. Unless something crazy happened, zombie apocalypse style, you're going to get 60 to 70% of current estimated benefits is what my opinion is.
Yeah. And that's basically what I did, Brad, is I took 75%. I think if you ignore it entirely, you're being too conservative. You're working longer than you have to work. So you can't ignore it. I think it's reasonable to be conservative and take a haircut on it. I always like surprises to the good rather than surprises to the bad. So I always plan conservatively, as did Teresa, by the way. We were so aligned as we went through all of our spending decisions. She's like, well, it could be 1,500 or 2,000. I'm going to go with 2,000 because I want to be conservative. And I'm like, man, you are just perfectly aligned with me. It's always
speaking
better.
To my soul.
Yes. It's there's a trade-off, right? If you're too conservative and you estimate all of your spending high and all of your investment returns low, you might end up working longer than you have to, right? So there's a trade-off there. But in general, my feeling is, and fortunately, Teresa and I were aligned on this approach, be a little bit conservative, have a little bit of fudge factor in your numbers, because once you get into retirement, it is so nice to say, wow, I'm only pulling 3.2% safe withdrawal rate. I thought I was going to be at 3.5 or whatever, right? It's better to have a surprise to the good.
Totally agree. I love that. So, okay, there's still a lot here. So, Teresa, we're talking about these spreadsheets. I think you're a spreadsheet lover. The three of us, I think, could all claim that at this point. As I'm seeing it, there are a couple different spreadsheets, right? So there's Fritz's net worth spreadsheet, which again, we'll have in the show notes. But then you created some type of income and spending spreadsheet. Talk me through that.
Yeah, so I've been tracking our spending for over 3 years now. I can't remember if it was one of your articles, Fritz, or if it was Billy and Acacia Catterley. I don't know if you guys have heard of them, but this couple has an online book that I downloaded many years ago, and they actually started, I think they retired back in the mid 90s, like before the FI movement was popular. And they really recommended calculating your daily spend rate. So that prompted me to start, okay, so every month I just record what I spend by category. I still love my paper and pencil, and I've got a little journal notebook, and I, by category, record how much I spend. And then once a month, I translate that into my spreadsheet. So by month for the past 3.5 years, I have my annual spending by category. Now, I actually just recently, within the last couple weeks, changed that up a little bit because, Brad, you interviewed Tiffany, the budgetista, and I really loved her split it before you get it technique. So I just rearranged my spreadsheet a little bit by expenses and then by discretionary spending, which I already had it modeled that way, but I went a step further and I pulled out my one-time spend and I isolated that in one category because I know, Fritz, as we were going through this business case, I'm like, well, I'm not going to spend this much when I retire because we did some remodeling on our home. We purchased a couple vehicles, just those one-time things that I don't anticipate that spending again in the future. So I isolated that spending to one particular line, and then I was able to really project how much I was going to spend even further. And then split it before you get it. I changed my paycheck and I created 2 new brokerage accounts so that one is exclusively for bills, taxes, insurance premiums, things like that. And then my second brokerage is just for spending, groceries, gas, fun, shopping, whatever. So yes, I do love spreadsheets. I've been tracking my spending for a long time, and it really prepared me for this business case with Fritz because I think we were able to get running on that very quickly.
Yeah, one thing I should say, Brad, too, Teresa obviously pays a lot of attention to this. One thing I'll say to the other listeners, I did not track my spending ever. We saved what was an aggressive savings rate. We knew we were saving, aggressively, so we knew we could spend the rest. And if you would have asked me how much do we spend on automotive versus this, or I couldn't have told you at all. I was like, hey, if it's in a checking account, we spend it. So how did I go about what we just talked about? You can't plan for retirement. You can't calculate your RE date without knowing a reasonable spending estimate. So in my case, we went through 11 months. We tried to go a year and we just couldn't do it. I don't have the tolerance that Teresa does. But for 11 months, we tracked every penny and we built a spreadsheet every month, broke it out by category, built the baseline, and then said, okay, now we know what we're actually spending. How is that going to change in retirement? And that's what we use for our calculation. So you can either go about it as Teresa did with very long tracking, very good, consistent records, or you can say, you know what, we've never really tracked this and start pulling out your credit card receipts or just start today and track it over the next year. But you've got to have a firm baseline for your spending because ultimately the decision on when you can retire is a math question. It's how much can you draw from your investments? How much other income are you going to have? And what's your spending going to be? And you can answer the spending question more accurately than the other ones. So you've got to do some work on the spending side.
Yeah, I love that. So critical to have your current spending or an idea of what your current spending is. But then clearly there are some adjustments.
Yeah.
Once you reach early retirement or any type of retirement. How did you both think about that in terms of Teresa's numbers or Fritz, how you conceptualize this?
I'll touch base on mine first, and then we'll talk about Teresa specifically. In our case, we thought about what and I don't think Teresa's quite there yet in terms of thinking about what your retirement lifestyle is really going to be. Hers is more, when can I retire, not what's retirement going to look like. And you have to do both. We'll touch maybe on that later. But so we basically said, okay, how is our life going to change? And what's that going to drive in terms of spending? So RVing was a big example. We knew we were going to RV a lot. So we said, okay, if we RV 100 days a year, campgrounds, $40 a night, certain number of miles, at certain miles per gallon, how much diesel are we going to have to buy for my truck, right? We did down to that level of detail to basically try to reflect, we were going to downsize, which we did. So we were going to sell the house. We were going to use the proceeds to pay off our mortgage. We knew our mortgage rates or our taxes were going to go down. So we modeled the big lifestyle changes and what that impact would be. In Teresa's case, I'll let her talk about it. The big question for her, I think, was the insurance question. And Teresa, I'll turn it over to you because that was a question in our case too. I planned conservatively. I went with a high open market number. Teresa kind of took a different approach, which I think was an interesting discussion as we went through this. So Teresa, you want to talk about that and any other questions or any other thoughts you had on the spending and retirement question?
Yeah, so let's start with the medical insurance because I currently carry the medical insurance for myself, my husband, and my 2 kids. So they can stay on until they're 26, which is another, 5, 6 years. So that's not an issue now. But when I retire and using the new retirement calculators, we were estimating about $1,000 for myself and for Paul if we went through ACA.gov for our medical insurance and $2,000 estimate. And now that has a lot to do with your income. So it's based on your income. That's how they determine your premiums. And it was really high and it was making my numbers a little bit short. And I wasn't really comfortable with that. So we're considering a Health Share Ministries coverage as an alternative, which the premiums are much more reasonable. We're both very healthy as of right now. We don't have reoccurring doctor appointments or, pharmaceuticals that we take. So I would be comfortable with using an option like that. And it's important to note that every time you use a government program, there's always stipulations that go along with it, which further complicates your numbers. So whether it, like I said, they base your premiums on your income, or like when you start withdrawing Social Security, the taxation is different. So, and you have IRMA limits. So there's a lot of additional factors that you need to consider when you're participating in government programs.
Yeah, and I think another thing, this shows how individual this whole retirement planning gets, right? The other big situation with Teresa and Paul was they've got 63% of their net worth in pre-tax, before tax, and they want to do Roth conversion. So you say, okay, well, look, let's just not do any Roth conversions. We'll go to zero income for a couple of years before we start Social Security. We can get all the ACA subsidies, and we get that just as cheap as a health sharing coverage. Yeah, but then you're not going to be able to do any Roth conversions, right? Which is something that Teresa wanted to do. So we had to work through what's the trade-off of doing Roth conversions and driving up your income, but potentially paying more for insurance versus do you do something, an alternative type of coverage, which is where she landed. So yeah, she's got 5 years until she has to really figure this out. But from a planning standpoint, the answer was, okay, let's just assume kind of a health sharing ministry type approach. We'll use those kind of spending. And let's layer in these Roth conversions during those first, 5 years of retirement when you've got low income and you can convert quite a bit of this over in those early years. And that's how we balanced out that dynamic.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Like you said, this is very, very personal. So I do want to jump in here quickly on the health sharing ministries. And just first off, health insurance premiums. I think we all are aware that if we live in America, we understand our system is almost irreparably screwed up. And we look at these premiums where, frankly, I'm paying $1,500 a month right now for my family. And we use our insurance very infrequently because we're all fairly healthy. But I look at it as catastrophic, get hit by a bus type scenario. And for me, that makes sense. It's just part of the deal, right? Like, obviously, I could complain and moan about it or move to a different country or whatever else I wanted to do. But this is the reality, right? So I think most of us are wondering, okay, what do we do? Like, how do we deal with this? How do I factor in? Okay, you just go to healthcare.gov and you find out what's the absolute worst case scenario. And it's, somewhere in the vicinity for a bronze plan, depending on your state, yada, 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 $1,000 to $1,200 a month for a family. And that's just a line item. Okay. Is it unfortunate? Yeah, it's really unfortunate, right? Like, we're not going to sugarcoat this. It's unfortunate. But okay, if that's the worst case scenario, that goes in my budget and it is what it is. So Teresa, like you were saying, depending on income, you can get subsidies for those premiums. And if you're at a point where you're retiring early and your income is dramatically reduced, well, the subsidies are going to be significant. But then, like Fritz so wisely said, okay, well, there's a give and take here if you want to do Roth conversions, right? So there's always a give and take.
Yeah.
And I think just us understanding this and knowing it gives us more information because, again, why we're doing an episode like this is how can someone else do this? What do they have to think through? And just final word is many years ago, I had my insurance, quote unquote insurance, it's not insurance, through Liberty Health Share. which I know, like you said, most of them have religious requirements. Liberty did not have a religious requirement. So that was one that our family chose for a couple of years. And to Liberty's great credit, they, for us, were fantastic. But I was always cognizant of the fact that it is not insurance. So in the back of your mind, you need to be aware that even if this company is good, and I'm not making a value judgment on any company, including Liberty, but even if they're good, even if they do what they say, it's not insurance. So there is some risk. And this is for everybody out there. You look at the health sharing ministries, the premiums are lower. There's no question about that. But usually the party that I found was the negative one was the hospital, actually. They balance billed. They came after us multiple times. Liberty went to bat for us. This was in just a fairly short bit of time. So I had some fairly significant issues with this whole deal. And that led me to stop being on Liberty and going to a traditional and true insurance because it was just too big of a risk for me. So, Teresa, I know you have wide eyes right now. This is not to frighten you. It's just to go in truly with eyes wide open of this is not insurance. So, Fritz, I know you're dying to get in here.
Well, no, we had exactly this discussion, Brad, Teresa, and I did when she said, I think I like the health sharing ministry approach. And I said, well, recognize it's not insurance and there is some risk. And I went through the same decision making, right? I retired at 55. And Brad, ironically, we took the same approach. We decided against the health sharing because I had used the higher numbers in our forecasting, in our spreadsheets. And I was like, look, I've already built it into the numbers. I know that we can cover it. Let's just buy, an open market plan. I ended up getting a retiree plan, which anyway, it doesn't matter. It's still not, it's going up a lot. It's $2,500 a month now for my wife and I. Now we're 60, right? We're getting older. But even to your point, it was in our numbers at that level. I planned conservatively and I planned $2,500 5 years ago. It's just now there now. So I'm like, oh, I'm actually to the good. What am I talking about?
You're ahead of the game.
I'm paying $2,500 a month. And I'm like, oh, that's okay. I got 5 years below that, right? Again, it's just a number. And you've got to think about your risk versus reward. And my anxiety was always, they can say no and there's nothing you can do about it. And that bothered me. That really bothered me. Not that we had anything to hide. I mean, but I would hate to end up with cancer and they say, oh, nope, it's something we're not going to cover because we think it's attributed to blah, 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 whatever. And there's nothing you can do. So you do have to think about that, Teresa. It's not just the cost. It's your peace of mind with taking on some of that risk of potential coverage issues.
Yeah. That goes back to my whole mortgage deal. Do we pay off our house early or not? It's not just a mathematical thing. It is an emotional thing.
Right.
Very much so. And I think a lot of personal finance truly is emotional, behavioral, and psychological. That's just the numbers. I wouldn't say they're easy, obviously, as shown by what you guys have done here, but they're the easier part, let's say, right? Like it's all in our head and that's okay. We're humans. This is what we do, right? So, yeah. Teresa, while we're on that though, because a lot of people do go back and forth, like what are you thinking in terms of paying off your mortgage before you hit RE?
Oh gosh, we paid it off in 2018.
Oh, that's right.
I don't regret it one bit. I don't regret
Nice.
it one bit, especially going through COVID and the possibility of losing our jobs. Not a problem. We had so much peace. It wasn't a worry at all. Highly recommend.
Yeah. I love it.
So, Brad, I think, talking about these things, these kind of show the considerations you have to think about. And the important thing is whether you're going to do a spreadsheet or whether you're going to do a calculator, you've got to think about these things because you've got to have some assumptions regardless of what tool you use to determine when you're going to retire. So let me go here. I guess we talked about the spreadsheet. We talked about the assumptions. It was a great exercise. It was very useful to have that as a baseline because we knew what the spending assumptions were. We knew what the net worth assumptions were. And that exercise in the spreadsheet was very helpful for when we shifted over to the second methodology, which I guess it's probably reasonable to go ahead and talk about that now.
Yeah, perfect timing.
Okay. So the second approach, quick reminder, the spreadsheet said she could retire 28, 29, somewhere in there, depending on your assumptions. Okay.
So 2028 or 2029. So about 5 years approximately.
Correct. Teresa was happy with that. We could show assumptions where she could retire in 2026. Right? You could have a much more aggressive market return. You could have lower retirement spending. You can make the numbers say what you want. So the beautiful thing with the spreadsheet is you could look at changing your assumptions and you could say, okay, if I want to retire by 2026, how much do I have to reduce my spending in order to be able to get to that 4% safe withdrawal rate, right? Or how much more aggressive do my returns have to be in order to support it? Because as she goes forward here, she's going to get actual returns for 2023, 2024, 2025. And if she's getting 10, 15% returns and we assumed 6 or 8, she's going to start seeing, hey, maybe 2026 is possible, right? So the spreadsheet gives you a nice baseline that you can make changes to see what's the impact if I do want to get out earlier. That was really helpful. That said, the most important part was getting the spending assumption and the net worth assumption, both of which we used when Teresa went into new retirement. And she did this entirely on her own. I've got to give her credit. I said, look, I'm not going to log into your new retirement. You already use it. Go in there and make sure all the numbers reflect this. And Teresa, we'll throw it over to you and your new retirement experience, and we'll circle back with our discussion with their model expert that went through your numbers with us.
Yeah, so that was really great because I was already a user. I actually had all of my accounts connected to new retirement. So I had live data to work with. But for the case of this study that we did, I unconnected everything and then just put in our numbers manually so they wouldn't change. And so that's what our study was based off of. And we met with Nancy, and she actually helped me update the model because I had some changes with income. The model requires a few workarounds when it comes to employer 401k matches. So she had to show me how to work around that. She was really great. And then we met with Bruce, who's a CFP. We walked through all of the assumptions that we had already put in. We had some conversations around the Roth conversions, which Fritz touched on already. And then he also pointed out that maybe I need to look at increasing my spending for the first 10 to 15 years after retirement because you're healthy and you're younger. You know, if you want to travel or whatever plan that you come up with, you want to be able to spend that money at that point in time. And then when you're older, your spending is going to be drastically reduced. So that's something also to consider. So there's just a lot of, I know we're not talking about specific numbers in this episode very much, but because that's so personal, that's like you said, Brad, the easy part of it. It's all the other things that you need to consider when you're working through your business case in your situation.
Right. It would almost be a distraction to talk about your specific numbers because it's really about the process, right? And I love what you said there, which is really the ethos of the Die with Zero book that I've mentioned so many times.
Die with Zero, Brad. I know you love that book. So yeah, that's funny.
You could see the idea forming in my brain because, right. I mean, when is your spending going to be significantly higher? It's going to be in those years when, hey, you can still travel as significantly as you want. This is not to say, obviously, that your life is over at 80 or some arbitrary number and it's all down. Like, we're not saying that clearly. But if you're honest with yourself, are you going to be able to travel and do more things at 50 or 55 or 60 than you are at 80, 85, 90? Yes, very obviously, by definition. So we're not telling anybody something that they don't know intuitively, but you need to think about this because your spending is not going to be the same every single year. And I think that's what's beautiful about tools like this is that they enable you to get much more granular than just a spreadsheet potentially. Those spreadsheets, obviously, we can make them as convoluted as we want. But most people just say, okay, my FI spending is going to be X. And then they game that out for a 30-year period. And the reality is, hey, sometimes you might pay off your house 6 years into FI. You might have a college payment for the first 2 years, but not for the rest of it. Like, you can adjust all this. And that's what's beautiful about using a much more significant tool like this.
Yeah, and I think, Brad, the other thing too is, I've always struggled with it. When you first retire, you're not going to have Social Security. Okay, I'm going to use a safe withdrawal rate of 3.5%. Well, realistically, if you look at what that turns into when Social Security starts, it's a lot less than 3.5%, right? So wait a minute, does that mean I can start with a higher safe withdrawal rate? Well, yeah, but how much higher? And how does that's really hard to do in a spreadsheet. And with a model, it does let you run that out and it'll show you the Monte Carlo. It'll show you the projected net worth. Even if you go to a 5%, 6% spending in the first couple of years before your Social Security kicks in, that may be totally fine because your withdrawal rate will drop so low after your Social Security starts. And that's hard to model in a spreadsheet, whereas a model like New Retirement captures that and it runs all the Monte Carlos around it and it shows you that's okay. Right? It's hard to model. I find that hard to model in a spreadsheet.
Yeah, agreed. And so, right, I think what a lot of us miss is that Social Security is current income in that year when you get it. And it reduces how you would do this calculation is, okay, my spending is X, $50,000. And I get Social Security of Y, just making up a number, $25,000. you're not taking like a safe withdrawal rate out of that Social Security. That is dollar for dollar. Hey, I'm using that to cover my life expenses. So in that case, okay, 50 minus 25, I just need to cover from my FI number, my pot of money, the $25,000 that's remaining, right? So Fritz, what you said, which is so brilliant, is that then significantly adjusts upward in an upward fashion your safe withdrawal rate for the years prior to when you get to Social Security.
Right.
And we just, again, we're so simplistic with this. All of us, when we think of this in our head, is like, okay, my FI number is this, my safe withdrawal rate is that. And it just goes out till infinity. It doesn't work that way. There's nuance. And what the punchline is, a lot of us are working more years than we have to, right? And what is the one non-renewable resource we have? It's our time. I think we're all being conservative upon conservative upon conservative with our numbers, which I get. I mean, believe me, I get it. But I think when you layer on 4 different levels of, oh, I'm just going to be a little more conservative with this number, it gets to a point that it's not reflecting reality.
Yeah, and the nice thing, if you look at, Teresa's case, again, we're talking about the second methodology, which was new retirement. We're not necessarily promoting them. It's just the model concept in general. You can play with scenarios of, I'm going to retire a year early. I'm going to retire 2 years early, and it will instantly show you your probability of success, right? So we did that, and we looked at, okay, right now we're going to say 2028, but what does 2027 look like? What does 2026 look like? We talked about how you can do that in a spreadsheet. It's as easy in the model as changing your retirement date, and it'll show you what your funding ratio is. That flexibility to help you decide how conservative you want to be in your number and how long you want to work, it's a functionality of these types of models that's really helpful because you can kind of vet out, am I being too conservative? Am I sandbagging every single number? And maybe I don't need to do that. And I told Teresa, she's planning 2028, 2029. I told her I'd be willing to bet she'll be able to retire earlier than that because I know how conservative we were on the growth assumptions, the spending assumptions. And she's going to continue to update this every year and look at the new retirement model when the actual numbers come in. And my guess is she'll be out by 2026, 2027. I'll say 2027, Teresa. I'll put $1 down that you'll be out by the end of 27.
Well, hang on to that dollar because I had a little life change.
Oh, no.
Both of my kids moved back home.
Wow.
Oh, I just lost $1. I'd rather lose my $1 than what you lost. Hey, that's life, right? So yeah, we had talked about in your assumptions, what should I assume for continued care for our kids, right?
Right.
And that's different than what you assumed.
It is. So Brad, after we recorded the first episode, my younger one moved home literally that weekend. And then my older one just moved home a week ago. So this is breaking news. It's not going to, derail our plan too much. They're pretty self-sufficient, but it does make me think a little bit more. I don't really think I'm going to extend past 2029. I think that is like my firm goal. But I'm also considering the idea of maybe working flex time, which is, 24 to 32 hours a week instead. That way we can have a little bit of income coming in and we can keep that medical coverage, reducing any huge premiums.
Right. It is very easy to fall prey to one more year syndrome, right? Which I think a lot of us are like, we want that safety. We want that security. It's natural. And again, to not wish away your life of like, okay, yeah, it would be a little safer. And yeah, the number is ugly. And I'm not giving you advice here, obviously, Teresa. This is your life. You have to figure out what works. But I would just caution. I've seen so many people do that because we're savers, right? Like we're people who we're worried about the future. We're thinking about the future. And sometimes that leads us to maybe make potentially suboptimal decisions for our lives. And if I could just quickly jump in on your kids are back, like I have to say, like that was such a gift that my parents gave to me. And I understand how fortunate I was to be in this position, but I lived at home for a couple of years after I graduated from college. And I mean, that was the springboard that set me up for my path to FI. I mean, I was able to save essentially 90% of my income for 2.5, 3 years. And it was remarkable. I was able to then purchase a co-op apartment on Long Island, and which turned into more equity. And it just, that was the springboard. So it was really just such a gift. So I'm speaking on behalf of your daughters. Like it's a really remarkable thing to be able to do that.
Yeah, I'm glad we were able to welcome them back home. And I am actually setting them both up with the split it before you get it method in brokerage accounts because, man, the money market rates are just so great right now instead of just a standard checking account.
Yeah. Oh, it's amazing. It's hard to pass up 5
It
plus
really is.
percent, right? We've mentioned before, the bank that I personally use is CIT Bank, which has I like them a lot. Their rate is really wonderful. So we have a link at ChooseFI.com/CIT. But Fritz, just real quick, I wanted to jump in. You said, obviously, New Retirement has bent over backwards to help us, and they've been a great friend of the show forever. That's not the only software that runs this. I know my buddy Chris Hutchins has used something called Projection Lab. So projectionlab.com. For people out there, we're not saying New Retirement is the only option. It's a fantastic option. And they helped so very much with this project for prior projects at ChooseFI. But there are different softwares of this. Just these pieces of software are just remarkable, though. And I think it's very important to get down to that granular level and use one of them. So just always want to throw out.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say, Brad, let me piggyback on your comment, because I said this to Teresa too, so I think it's important. It's so easy to get concerned about when am I going to have enough to retire, right? And the one more year. It goes with the die with zero approach. I actually wrote an article, my most recent post, called The Three-Legged Stool of Retirement. And when you were talking about this, it triggered the thought. There's 3 legs on your stool. One is your money, one is your time, and one is your health. And as much as we focus on money, the reality of it is money will be the last leg standing on that stool. You're going to run out of your health and you're going to run out of your time before you run out of your money. Almost guaranteed, right? If you're a conservative, if you listen to this show, if you manage your money, unless you retire at 25 or something stupid, right? If you're methodical like Teresa is, and you're managing this and you're making educated decisions, you're probably, think about this, the safe withdrawal rate concept is kind of worst case scenario. So in anything better than a worst case scenario, you're going to have more money than you think, because that's based on the lowest success rate over the past, the Trinity study, right? Over the past 50 years, what's the level you could withdraw from that would work in basically every market environment? So by definition, that's a lower than average market return. So you do have to be careful about getting hung up on the what ifs, because they will eat you alive. You can never answer the question, absolute black and white. Teresa, you can retire in December of 2028. You'll never have to worry another day in your life. You can never make that kind of statement, because there are always the kids that move back home. There's always the roof that needed replaced. There's always the car accident, right? There's always that health issue. Those things are life. Don't get so focused on, and this isn't to Teresa, this is to everybody, don't get so focused on the money side that you don't realize that the more scarce resources are actually the time and your health. Those are as scarce or more than the financial side of it.
Yeah, here. And that's a big part of certainly why so many of us are really focusing on our health now, right? Is how can you extend what's known as the health span? You may or may not be able to affect your lifespan, which is the number of years you're going to live. You probably have some level of impact on that, but that health span, the number of healthy years, you have to put in the work, right? And this is really an important part of this three-legged stool of just life in general. Is you have to realize as you get older, again, just biological fact is we start losing muscle. Then it all just kind of keeps compounding negatively in terms of, okay, I can't walk as easily. And then it just keeps going and going and going. So you have to understand that's going to happen. I'm spending 6 hours a week at the gym lifting weights at this point. And it's because I understand I can do this at 44, but I need to set the groundwork for what is it going to look like when I'm 75, 85, hopefully 95, right? And there's things I want to still be able to do. And I have to put the work in now, because it doesn't just magically appear, right?
You've obviously read Peter Attia's Outlive, which is a great book. I read that too. And that's where the health span concept. And the thing that really struck me with that book is he talks about, let's say your dream is at 75 years old, you want to be able to pick up your granddaughter or grandson. Okay, let's say it's a 40-pound grandkid at 75. Well, that means you got to be able to pick up like 80 pounds today, right? Because you will naturally atrophy. And that concept from that book, I've started doing protein supplements as a result of that book. I started taking the fish oil, right? He's got some really good tactical advice. And I've always done weights since I've retired. I didn't beforehand. I've always been a runner. But focusing on the weights is hugely important. It's not just cardio, right? It's cardio and weights. So yeah, that's one of those legs of the stool, right? So you can manage your investments to maximize the return. You can manage your health to maximize your return. You can manage your time, right? You talk about the 1% stuff. A lot of that is time related. How do you be more efficient with your time to do the things that you want to do rather than wasting your time doing things that aren't of value to you. Each one of the legs, you can have a discussion just like we just had on health, just like we've been having on financial. You should think that way about each one of those legs and invest in all three of them equally.
Yeah, Fritz, I love that. And as you surmise properly, I've been following Dr. Attia for many, many years. And yeah, it's just so important to think about this. And it touches every aspect of your life. And like you said, it really is, it's all of these things. It's not just the finances. We need to really think of it. So kind of speaking of, it's not just there were two different parts of how you both went through this case study. And obviously, we have spent this whole episode, and this is really where we're largely going to stop here, but we spent this whole episode thinking about the process, right? Like, how do you get to the point where the numbers make sense? I'm confident with the numbers. I feel like in the future, this is my date. And now, obviously, Fritz, like you said before, reality intervenes, both good and bad, right? Which is, this is not just something you do one time. As new reality comes in, and every year there are market returns, there's new income, there are new expenses. You update this, right? Like, this is not just set in stone. Teresa's going to close her eyes and wake up in 2029 and ta-da, here I am, right? She might find out that ta-da moment comes in 2027, like you think it might. And that's what's great about this. So there's that side, but then there's also, okay, preparing my actual finances for early retirement. What do I think about in the years beforehand? Do I think about, as Fritz, you love, the different buckets, right? And we talked about this a lot a couple of years back in episode 206, which I think we entitled What Happens When the Paycheck Stops. But I wanted to give you just a couple minutes, maybe to just give a super high level overview of how you thought about that with Teresa. And then, like I said, I think that's outside the scope of what we can do in this one episode, but we can refer people to articles on your site and that prior episode for sure.
Yeah, great. I think I agree. It's a good point to wrap. And really the focus has been, how do you decide when you can retire? For Teresa, we answered the question. It's 2028, right? Maybe earlier. We'll watch every year. But we answered the question. We went through the process, and it was a great exercise. And Teresa, I really admire you. You're a remarkable woman, and congratulations on reaching this point. To your comment, though, Brad, that's not the end of it. You know, the second phase, and Teresa and I did go through this. It's in the article. I'm sure you'll put it in the show notes that I wrote up about the case study. We also spent quite a bit of time saying, okay, now as you get closer to this retirement date, here's some of the things you've got to think about. And the biggest one that jumps out as kind of being obvious when you think about it is you've got to build a little bit of a cash buffer, right? You can't just be selling stocks every year to fund your spending because you run into that sequence of return risk. Well, how do you build, let's say you want to have 3 years of cash. You can't wait until 6 months before you retire to start building 3 months of cash, right? So part of what Teresa's doing now is redirecting some of those savings to start building those buckets, which is what I use, but you don't have to. But you have to have some kind of liquidity buffer. So there's a whole stage of things as you move from the accumulation phase to the withdrawal out of your investments, of positioning your portfolio and how do you think about that? That's all in the article. And it is a part of this planning, but it's kind of the second phase of this planning. And then the third thing is not only the financial stuff, but the psychological preparedness for retirement, the soft side, as I call it. And I would say both of those, if you're thinking about a process, the first process is, when can I retire? The second process is, how do I transition my portfolio for retirement? And the third process is, what am I going to be when I retire? Those are the three phases to the general planning.
Yeah, I love that. And yeah, we have been remiss to this point of not mentioning this incredible case study article that you put on your website. So that is really essential for everybody. If you're listening to this and you've gotten to this point in the episode, check out this article. I'll link it in the show notes. It's this case study of Teresa. And like you said, Fritz, you go into a lot of the numbers, but then there's also this critical part at the end, the strategy overview, the final working years, and then the drawdown strategy overview, the retirement years. And I think that's where people will get a lot outside of the scope of what we're doing here. So yeah, super duper helpful. Teresa, like Fritz said, this is amazing. I'm just so happy for you. I mean, to see the remarkable path you've taken, it is just so inspiring. And I just want to thank you for being a member of our community, for coming on the podcast, for being so open. It's remarkable. And now to reach FI in your 40s and retire early, that's not too shabby, right?
My heart is just overflowing with gratitude for you, Fritz, and for you, Brad. in this whole community, because I wouldn't be here if I hadn't found this show all those years ago to kind of help me, guide me and lead me and to poise myself to be in this position. I'm just extremely thankful. I appreciate all the time and effort you guys poured into me. And like I always tell my kids, you win or lose by the way you choose.
Oh, that is beautiful. What a perfect way to end the episode. So thank you both. Teresa, again, thank you for being here. Fritz, a huge thank you for all the time and care you put into this. It's remarkable. And to our friends in New Retirement, they just went out of their way to help. I mean, hooking you up with a CFP to chat with and to use their software, it's just amazing. So yeah, huge thank you to everybody involved.